My name is Alana Guth, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I've had the pleasure of working at the center for 2 years, and I'm very excited to introduce Marina Gorbis as the closing keynote speaker of the day. I got a peek at the work she does in the Foresight workshop earlier this afternoon, and I cannot wait to hear what she has to say to add to this conversation. Marina is an executive director of the Institute for the Future, which is a 50-year-old nonprofit research and consulting organization based in the Silicon Valley. She has brought a futures perspective to hundreds of organizations in business, education, government, philanthropy, and civic society. Marina's current research focuses on transformations in the world of work in new forms of value creation. She launched the Workable Futures Initiative at IFTF with the aim of developing a deeper understanding of new work patterns and to prototype a generation of positive platforms for work. She has introduced the concept of universal basic assets as a framework for thinking about different types of assets and the role they play in economic security. Universal Basic Assets Framework also highlights a variety of approaches and tools we can use to achieve wider asset distribution and greater equity. So without further ado, here is Marina Gorbis.
Great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes? And let me see if I can get my slides up. Great, seems to be working. Thank you so much, and great to be with you. And what a tough act to follow, Sarita and Erica. I really admire their work, and hopefully what I have to say very much connects to what they've written about and what they talk about and what they've been working on. I want to share with you, and I'm excited to share with you some of our thinking and research from a project we just recently started, but it follows years of work and research looking at how work is changing and workers' lives and some of the technology transformations. In this project that we started at the Institute for the Future, we call it the Equitable Enterprise Initiative. And I'm going to start with just giving you a definition of what we think is of an equitable enterprise. And we think of it as business structures and strategies that allow people to equitably distribute economic assets among those who contribute to the value of the business. Why do we use this term assets? We all know about the income inequality. And although income inequality is large in this country, wealth inequality dwarfs it. It's 10 times greater than asset inequality. Why it's important? In economics, people define income as kind of money that comes in, flows through the household. It's what you earn through wages or other kind of income, but it comes and goes through the household. Wealth is like a well. It is really much more connected to longer-term economic security. It determines where you live. It determines what school your kids go to. It determines your community that you live in, all these other things. Wealth is also something that's passed on from generation to generation. So it's something really important, not just for you, but for the next generation. And ultimately, it's this kind of risk mitigation. When something happens, when you have any kind of emergency, medical emergency, or you lose your job, it's like a well you go to. So if you have this, you always have something to turn back on. So it's much more connected to longer term economic security. And in wealth, as I said, is basically your assets. Your assets are things like your savings, your equity ownership, your pension funds. Those are financial assets, but there are other things like your home. There's non-financial assets, again, community and others. So ultimately, wealth is really the way economists look at wealth is your assets minus your debt. So that's why the conversation about assets is so important. And as you heard before, we did a whole series of workshops and published a manifesto around basic assets and how that is important. And unfortunately, what we're seeing today in kind of enterprises that are around us and that are being new ones that are being created, a lot of platforms and gig work, is that it actually is not enabling people to build out those assets and ultimately wealth that's really important for longer term economic security. And that is a big problem. So that's really why we started this project. We're seeing the way work is being transformed and how it's not allowing people to build up these important assets and ultimately wealth for longer term economic security. So let me just start with a little bit of data. People view it as a really positive story. In the last 2 years, the number of applications for new businesses has skyrocketed. And actually, the new business formation since 1970s has been down. We have fewer and fewer companies being created. So it's really interesting during this pandemic in the last 2 years that the number of applications for new businesses has really gone up. But if you look at that top line, that black line, that's the highest one, it's applications for one-person businesses. It's not the kind of business, it's basically one-person operations, one person creating these kinds of enterprise forms. And the green line are kind of businesses that intend to hire more employees. So what we're seeing is really more and more these one-person operations, one-person businesses being created. And it probably, some of these businesses probably looks familiar. It's people deciding, it's people who are influencers, who are creatives, who are deciding to put up a website, and they can go to Patreon or Kickstarter. They can they can advertise, do these things on their own. They're willingly and starting these businesses. This notion of great resignation, or people being discontent with working in large organizations, this is happening, and people are starting these one-person or very small businesses on their own, becoming independent in some ways. And by the way, a lot of them, it looks pretty glamorous on the surface, right? But there's a lot of research that shows that actually there's a lot of stress that these people experience as they become independent, because you can imagine that as a single operation, you basically have to do everything that previously a whole company or a whole organization, you had to do it. So it's not as glamorous as it looks, and people are suffering from burnout and stress and all kinds of things. So not as great necessarily, or not for everybody. So, but some people are doing it willingly, and other people, it's pure necessity. This is from a series of interviews that my colleagues and I conducted throughout California, where a lot of people are working multiple sort of gig work, or they're combining working part-time in a company or an organization, but they just can't survive on what they're making. So they're having to do 2 or 3, working on multiple platforms and working really a lot of hours, 60, 70 hours a week just to make a living. So this is, whether it's by choice or out of necessity, by choice because it's easy to go independent in some ways. There are all these possibilities and technologies and platforms that you can access that would help you do that. But some people are doing it by choice, and for other people, it's just out of necessity to make a living. But either way, there's a kind of a fundamental change going on in how people work and how what labor employment relationship looks like. And a lot of times we think of this as a kind of a technology-driven transformation. Well, it's because we have these platforms, we have apps, we have Uber, we have Lyft, we have Upwork, all these things. But really, as futurists, we're not just looking at the future. A lot of our work is really going in the past and understanding history and why is this happening and these larger patterns. And really what we know is that the way we work is actually not something that's set in stone. It's not preordained. There are a lot of factors that shape how we work and the form of organizations that we work in. So, if you look at social and cultural norms, Not too long ago, slavery was an accepted in the South form of sort of economic organization, and people thought they couldn't live without it until it became morally unacceptable and ultimately politically unacceptable. We couldn't be working remotely without the technologies. So technologies do have something to contribute. Obviously regulation is important. Things like minimal wage regulation, disclosures about what kind of disclosures companies have to make, the power relationships, who has the power in the market, labor availability, and all these other things. So it's not something that just kind of set in stone. Is something that's very much shaped by all of these factors. And this is a traditional organizational chart that probably generations of people, this is something that we've evolved. This is what business schools teach, how to manage, how to lead, how to be in these kinds of organizations. This is what we're used to. And this is just in the last 100 years that we've perfected this form of formal hierarchical organizations. If you look at the long history of how people lived and survived for a very, very long time, this is a relatively new phenomena for the last 100 years. And people before that, doesn't mean that they were sitting and doing nothing. They were creating, they were selling, they were trading, but they were doing it on a very small scale, right? And so this is a kind of a social technology that we created over the last 100 years that allowed us to sort of scale production, do more, achieve this kind of scale. And this is a kind of in a way, we think of it as a social technology that we've evolved. And that technology is changing. There was a Nobel Prize economist, Ron Coase, who famously asked this question, so why do we need these kind of large formal organizations? Why don't we just continue doing what we've done for a very long time, which is trade with each other, produce on a small scale and do these things? And his answer was that, yeah, you can do it if you're doing it in very small sort of batches, if you're doing it on a small scale. If you want to reach larger markets, if you want to produce more, you have to negotiate with a lot of vendors. You have to do marketing and advertising, and it's just cheaper and more economically efficient if you bring it all under one organization. It reduces what he called transaction costs. So it's kind of economically was efficient for people to have these kinds of large organizations because it ultimately reduced their costs of running businesses, made it more efficient, and obviously increased profits as a result. And that is what's changing. If you think about these transaction costs, the costs of finding customers, the costs of finding vendors, the cost of negotiating things, all of that things, those transaction costs, with the help of technologies that we have, in a lot of times they're kind of close to zero. So now, yeah, you can advertise through TikTok or Instagram or thousands of other media platforms where you can advertise your wares. You can find people, sometimes your vendors and somebody to produce things. You can hire people through all these different ways. So it makes it possible to basically do things in a very different way without creating these large organizations. And that's probably why we're seeing all of these creatives and entrepreneurs and new businesses being started on a very, very small scale, right? So that's a bigger transformation. Sarita talked about how we're in a period of a really major transformation. And to me, the big transformation is really in the nature of the kind of enterprise through which we are working, how we get our incomes, how we generate wealth, and all these other things. So that's the kind of the transformation. And you're seeing it in some of the numbers. This is research that shows that actually the number of large public American corporations that are listed on the stock exchange has been cut in half since early 90s. And this is not because of mergers and acquisitions. This is places like Blockbuster basically going out of business. A lot of these kind of corporations that created jobs and hired a lot of people, they are basically disappearing. And the new kind of companies, if you look at the Americans' wealthiest companies, which a lot of them are tech companies, they're actually not large employers. So if you look at Facebook, for example, we all know Facebook, very successful company, right? But data is a little bit old, but it's about today 70,000 people, staff, right? You look at Apple, 150,000 people. And what are the kind of the biggest employers? It's actually Walmart, 2.3 million people, and it's Amazon, 1.3 million people. And the average wages, the average compensation is somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. So what we're seeing is that the successful companies, the sort of the more profitable companies are actually not large employers. And the large employers that we have today, unfortunately, are low-wage employers. And there's been a lot of, when we talk about technology, and I have to bring it up because a lot of our conversations and solutions when we think about technologies and automation is about upskilling. So let's upskill everybody because there are these, technology jobs out there and we need to upskill everybody. And I would like to point out that actually we have, at least in terms of degrees, we have the highest educated labor force in history. Something like 35% of workers today have at least a bachelor's degree, right? So it's hard for us to say we need to, I'm all for upskilling and I'm all for education. It has all kinds of benefits, public benefits, social benefits, health benefits, you name it. I'm all for it, but we cannot argue that it's because we don't have a educated and skilled labor force that we're having these kinds of inequities in terms of wealth and in terms of assets. And if you're seeing this, so you can see how education levels have improved greatly and wages have not budged over the same period of time. So it's hard to make that solution be just about upskilling. And, if you think about it, okay, well, maybe you can argue that maybe people are educated in the wrong things. Maybe we need everybody to be educated in tech and STEM. And I don't know how many postdocs who have a PhD in physics or biology who are working for very little money as postdocs. And this shows actually that we're graduating a large number. The blue line are the people who are graduating with degrees in those areas like life sciences. And the orange line is the number of job openings that require those kind of degrees and that kind of knowledge. So you can see even in engineering, we're still producing more engineers than there are jobs out there. And the only area where we can argue that there is probably some shortages is in computer science. But I'm not, and again, depends on areas and geography where it's at. So the solution is not about, there's something in the nature of the enterprise itself, and it's not in just fixing the education and doing more degrees and upskilling, which is all great and should be done. But that's not going to solve the issues of wealth and income inequalities that we're seeing. And those are really the result, we believe, of the kind of form of enterprise that we have evolved, and particularly the new kinds of enterprise forms and the new ways that people are working that is creating even greater wealth and income inequalities. And if you take it from, if you think about the platforms, and Sarita and they talked about gig work, but technologies is a piece of the story because technology is enabling us to do things in new ways. It allows us to basically break down tasks, jobs into tasks, and recruit people to do them. Whoever is available, whoever can do it, not just hire staff. You can hire people online who are not your staff. So yeah, technology makes this possible, a lot of these things, but technology makes possible a lot of other things. And ultimately, we do shape our technologies. And in its current form, what is happening is that we're creating a lot of asset poor work. Whether it's gig work or independent work or contract work or whatever you call it, it's a continuation of what David Weil, an economist, called fissured work, which is work that's separated from an organization, from a formal organization. And as I said, by itself, it may not be the worst thing in the world. We're transforming into a different way of working, but in its current environment, it's basically it's not allowing people to accumulate these really key assets: retirement, health benefits, protections, holidays, good pay, all of these other things. It's not allowing people pathways for advancement. It creates a lot of loneliness. People are doing this by themselves. They don't have communities, and it creates a lot of risks. A lot of this work is highly monitored. There's data collection that happens, all kinds of old and basically new risks that we're facing in this new environment. And in its kind of worst case scenario, where we're going with this, unless we shape it and do something that creates this generation of equitable enterprises, it might look something like this, where, this is typical. You can see it in various areas. This is Home Depot, where particularly immigrant workers, somebody basically hires a crew and says, who is willing to work today for this money? And you hire a crew for the day or a couple of days. And I like this cartoon that shows that actually it's not about just this kind of low wage work that we think about. This is possible to do in any kind of what we think of knowledge work or higher paid work. You can do the same with accountants. You can do it with lawyers. And we interviewed doctors who are feeling like very similar. Their work experience is very similar to the gig workers, where they probably have to serve 5 hospitals, emergency rooms, and go from one to another. So it's a bigger transformation than just what we think of as low wage work that we need to address. And at the Institute, we have this notion of 2 curves. Like, we talk about this transformation, and we're kind of right in the middle of it, where basically in the period of transformation, we're kind of living along 2 curves at the same time. One is the curve that we've lived on for a long time. This is that big formal organization, hierarchical, where we've developed laws, we developed regulations, we know how to work this way, but this way of doing things is kind of on the decline. At the same time, we're seeing kind of this new curve emerging, and a lot of the people I showed, the creatives, the gig workers, the independent workers, that's a new form of doing work. And as I said, this is something that is really urgent for us. We have agency to shape this curve to deliver more equitable outcomes. We just need to change how we think about the nature and function of the enterprise, of the business enterprise. We've been operating on this idea that came from Milton Friedman, that the only social responsibility of business is basically to create value for shareholders. So it's very much driven by the shareholder goals and what you deliver to them. And in our equitable enterprise work, we're trying to change those values and beliefs to say, what we need to build a kind of enterprise that basically maximizes and distribute economic returns more equitably to people who are contributed to those activities, to those values. So how we do that, and I'm going to do this briefly. As I mentioned, there are a lot of levers that we have for shaping this. And in this map that we're about to release around all these actions and areas that we can sort of activate to shape a more equitable enterprise, these large sort of squares or whatever they are, they're those levers that we're looking at. And Sarita talked about, and Erica talked about labor. Obviously, how do we organize labor, and really how does labor gains power in this kind of work, particularly informal labor, and people who've never been part of the formal labor. Domestic workers is a perfect example, and what they're talking about is exactly about that. What about capital? If we want to create co-ops or other kind of more distributed forms of enterprise, community trusts, mutual benefit kind of organizations, we also need to think about how do we create sources of capital that invest in those kinds of enterprises. Everything from community banks to public banks to cooperative banks that have existed in this country but really don't exist as much today. So we need to kind of revive them. Ownership structures, again, there's a whole variety of different organizational forms, cooperatives, ESOPs, employee stock-owned companies, community trusts, housing cooperatives, all kinds of other ways that we can create more distributive kind of enterprises. But unfortunately, a lot of times they don't have access to capital, we don't have resources for them, and so on. The technology infrastructure, the public technology infrastructure, because they're all based on using these digital technologies. So we need to think of them as utilities that are available to more people. Community, obviously creating community wealth rather than just individual wealth. And finally, and I want to emphasize that, where do people learn about how to create those enterprises and how to run them? So we have business schools that really teach people how to run, manage, start the enterprises that I talked about, the enterprises that still follow sort of notions of shareholder primacy. We don't have enough service providers, we don't have enough attorneys, we don't have enough experts who can really help people start these all different kinds of businesses. So thinking about kind of how we change our education and business education so people can create more of these more equitable enterprises. And at the end, I just want to emphasize again, a lot of times we think of this as a technology-driven transformation. And yes, technology plays a role in this, but I always like to say we shape our technologies, and so we shape our enterprises. All these other things that I mentioned, the levers that we have, is really, that's the urgent task, to activate and think about how do we shape, how do we take this moment of transformation and really shape it in a desirable direction. Thank you.